Hey guys, and welcome to Lent Day 38. Today we're looking at Pilate is pressured by the crowds. This is in Luke's Gospel, chapter 23, verses 13 to 26. Pilate called the chief priests, the rulers and the people. "You brought this man before me," he said to them, "on the grounds that he was leading the people astray. Look here then, I examined him in your presence and I found no evidence in him of the charges that you're bringing against him. Nor did Herod. He sent him back to me. Look, there is no sign that he's done anything to deserve death. So I'm going to flog him and let him go." "Take him away," they shouted all together. "Release Barabbas for us." Barabbas had been thrown into prison because of an uprising that had taken place in the city for murder. Pilate spoke to them again with the intention of letting Jesus go. But they shouted back, "Crucify him." "Why?" he said for the third time. "What's he done wrong? I can't find anything he's done that deserves death, so I'm going to beat him and let him go." But they went on shouting out at the tops of their voices, demanding that he be crucified, and eventually their shouts won the day. Pilate gave his verdict that their request should be granted. He released the man they asked for, the one who'd been thrown into prison because of rebellion and murder, and gave Jesus over to their demands. As they led him away, they grabbed a man from Cyrene called Simon, who was coming in from the city from the countryside, and they found him to carry the crossbeam behind Jesus. Shakespeare peopled his plays as Charles Dickens did his novels with fascinating minor characters. Each has his or her own tale to tell. None is mere cardboard figure. Even the bear in A Winter's Tale is important. Among the evangelists, Luke has the most interesting cast of minor characters, and two of them come into focus here: Barabbas and Simon of Cyrene. Together they help Luke tell us not only what happened to Jesus, but why it happened and what it means for us. We need to think into their own stories to see the tragic day unfold from their perspective and to learn from them both. Barabbas was not a common criminal. Luke informs us that he had been thrown into prison for his part in a violent rebellion that had taken place in Jerusalem. This is all we know about this particular rebellion, since the non-Christian historian Josephus doesn't mention another uprising at this time. We can assume that such events were a regular occurrence, that in the ancient world, as, alas, in the modern, the Middle East was a place where political and social frustration would regularly spill over into violence, sometimes focused on particular targets, sometimes mindless and born of apparent hopelessness of the cause. It was, of course, because of such events that both the Romans and the chief priests were nervous of popular or messianic movements, not least at the time of major festivals. We know about Barabbas, but we must assume that he was only one of many rebel leaders in this period. He escaped crucifixion that Passover time, but the cross claimed many, perhaps dozens or even hundreds, even when no major disturbance had taken place. Luke describes the event in such a way that we can hardly miss the point. Barabbas is guilty of some of the crimes of which Jesus, though innocent, is charged: stirring up the people, leading a rebellion. We don't know whether he saw himself or whether his followers saw him as a possible king of the Jews, but that is not unlikely. One of them is to die, and it turns out to be Jesus. Luke does not explain, as Mark and Matthew do, the custom Pilate used to release one prisoner for the crowds to celebrate the holiday. But it is clear that things come down to a choice. Either Barabbas or Jesus must die. Either the one who stands for violent revolution, which Jesus had opposed from the beginning, or the one who has offered and urged the way of peace. Jesus ends up dying the death appropriate for the violent rebel. He predicted that he would be reckoned with the lawless, and it has happened all too soon. Luke's readers are by now used to seeing Jesus in company with tax collectors and sinners. We have been told from many angles and with many parables that this was the appropriate and necessary focus of his ministry, embodying the outstretched love of God to all in need, going in search of lost sheep wherever they may be found. We were not, perhaps, quite prepared for it to end like this. It is one thing for Jesus to go in to eat with a man who is a sinner. It is a considerable step beyond that for him to go off and die the death of the violent rebel. But this is in fact the climax and focus of the whole gospel. This is the point for which Luke has been preparing us all along. All sinners, all rebels, all the human race are invited to see themselves in the figure of Barabbas, and as we do, we discover in this story that Jesus comes to take our place under condemnation for sins and wickedness great and small. In the strange justice of God, which overrules the unjust justice of Rome and every human system, God's mercy reaches out where human mercy could not only sharing, but in this case, substituting for the sinner's fate. It is because of this that the call goes out. Once we realize what Jesus is doing, for each of us to take up our own cross and follow him. This is, of course, where the call to Simon comes in. He had come on pilgrimage to Jerusalem from one of the Jewish communities in North Africa. The shores of the eastern Mediterranean were covered with Greek and Roman settlements, and in most there was a sizable Jewish community, and found himself a pilgrim in a very different sense. Criminals on their way to execution normally carried the crosspiece of their own cross as part of the shame and torture of the whole experience. Luke does not explain why Jesus was unable to carry it for himself, but it takes little imagination to fill in the blank. The previous 24 hours had exhausted him, and he could barely stagger through the streets to the western gate. On several occasions in the Gospel, Jesus had urged his followers to take up their cross and follow him. Here at last someone is doing so, and even more, carrying Jesus' own cross. Simon becomes the model for all those, in devotion, holiness and service, tread behind Jesus on the road of humility, pain, and even death. Though Barabbas and Simon are the key to this passage, we should once more notice the crowds and sorrowfully identify with them. The mixture of disappointment at a failed messianic movement and fear of what might now happen if the Romans or the chief priests regarded them as supportive of its leader drove the mob to make what all history has regarded as the wrong choice. At the same time, Luke was well aware of God's overruling of this too. For the purposes of salvation, God turns even human wrath and mistakes to serve his plans. And as we reflect on the role of the small parts within Luke's large drama, we should remind ourselves that our own parts, small though they may seem, may also contribute substantially to the work of the gospel as it goes forwards. Neither Barabbas nor Simon dreamed that day that their names would be known and their stories told around the world, 2,000 years hence. How much more when we follow this Jesus and carry his cross, can we be sure that God will use our small labours and sufferings within his larger work? So, for reflection today, contemplate the significance of Simon of Cyrene's act of carrying Jesus' cross. How can you emulate Simon's example in your own life by carrying the burdens of others and walking in humility and selflessness? The crowds that pressurized Pilate to condemn Jesus were driven by disappointment and fear. How does this resonate with the human tendency to make choices based on popular opinion or self-preservation? Reflect on moments in your life when you have been influenced by external pressures and the importance of aligning your choices with God's purposes, even in the face of opportunity or uncertainty. Thanks for watching, and see you tomorrow.